Okay, so in this video I'm going to be talking about how I'm prepping for my Changeling the Lost one-off session. Now, as you can see over on that side of the screen, I'm going to be screen capturing my desktop, and down below I've got the book cam where you can see all the various books I'll be using. I've got my eyewitness guide to New York where the game's being set. I've got, of course, got my Changeling the Lost rulebook, and I've got my Dungeon World rulebook, since I intend to be using the ideas about fronts and how to prepare them to help me keep the plot straight for this one-shot game. So you should now be able to see this map that I've made containing the relationship details of the various NPCs. This is handy because it allows me to see it all at a glance rather than having to read a massive wodge of text. Of course, I'll tidy it up a bit before the actual game, but that gives you a rough idea of how the NPCs and a couple of the organisations and other NPCs I'm planning on introducing relate to each other. And it's easy to alter so that I can add to it, subtract to it, or make alterations during play. And here is the notes that I'm making for the game currently. You can see the themes: beauty, madness, survival / loss of control, and memory. And here is the clip notes version of the character notes that I've made just for my own quick reference purposes during the session planning. And if I scroll down that, you can get a bit better look at that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at something called the 5-room model, which is an idea that I first came across in the role-playing tips newsletter by John 4, and it's something I often reference when I'm creating a session, especially if it's a one-off session, and I'll put a link to where you can find about this in the description down below. So if I click on there, the 5-room model says that a dungeon should consist of 5 rooms or 5 main sort of plot points. Now, although I don't very often run dungeon crawls, since I don't find them particularly interesting per se, the 5-room model can be very easily adapted into other styles. So we can see here that it talks about room 1, the entrance and guardian, which is basically a reason why the plot hasn't been dealt with, investigated before. We have room 2, which is a puzzle or role-playing challenge, and this is a trial that cannot be resolved by combat. Room 3 is a red herring. Which is building tension or adding in additional background flavour. Room 4 is the climax or conflict. This is the main showdown. And finally, room 5 is the plot twist. Okay, so we've got the basic template for our 5-room model set up, so let's start putting down a few ideas. I'm still in the brainstorming stage at this point, although I've got a few ideas in my head, but it's good to just bang as many ideas as you can down. After all, you can winnow out the weaker ones or add in stuff later, but it's good to get down as much as you can in this stage. So, room 1. The reason why the plot hasn't been dealt with or investigated before: the entrance and the guardian. So I think it's safe to say part of the reason it hasn't been investigated before, as we've hinted at in the background, is that people are only abducted every 10 years, and they always reappear again shortly afterwards with convenient excuses for their absence, although often with changes in their character. Now, those of you who know a bit about Changeling will know that I'm referring to people being replaced by fetchers here. So I'm going to write a note down for that. Kidnap victims replaced by fetchers who assume their roles in the mortal world. I'm going to say there's going to be a fetch for each PC, and most of the NPCs who were kidnapped along with them, even though the NPCs didn't escape back to the mortal world. Now, I do like this idea of a guardian, because we must assume that there is some reason that the Horned God and his Fey minions keep coming back to this area. They've probably got some sort of protection to make sure that people aren't wandering the area, or to keep an eye out for escapees, since they may assume that they would come back to the place where they were originally kidnapped from. So I'm going to put in here some sort of Fey minion who watches the park and attempts to recapture escaped changelings. And this could potentially give us a good first sort of encounter to get us straight into something exciting and interesting, so we don't have that sort of lull at the start of a session. And it also serves as a handy thing to get the players used to the actual rules system, since whether you like combat or things like that, there's no denying that throwing people into a fairly straightforward combat is a great way to learn the basic rules, rolling challenges, etc. So let's see. Obviously we want this Fey minion to be fairly well disguised in the mortal world, and I'd quite like to link it in with the idea of the fetches. So if I look back at our relationship diagram, we can see that Bones was originally working with a detective, Mark Soranzo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a fetch detective Mark Soranzo. Guards the park and looks out for escaped changelings. I'll put him up there. And the original detective was replaced by. And that'll serve 2 points, since hopefully it will get Bones involved in investigating, since he'll know that the original detective was kidnapped along with himself, and it will also introduce the players to the idea of fetches. And since I wanted the players to get the idea that the fetches are artificially created creatures, they're not so much human, but they are things that are made by the Fae, I'm going to say that when this fetch is killed, he collapses into a collection of inanimate objects held together by wisps of shadow. say the shadow wisps equal the darker part of the original's soul. The reason why the Horned God took the original. And this should hopefully give the player characters pause as to what their own fetches are composed of and what darker parts of them that led to the original Horned God taking them. Also, if we have a look at Bones' character sheet, we can see that he has the Darkness contract. So using Darkness contract, Bones would be able to find out more about this. And the darkest part of Detective Saranzo will be, if we have a quick look back at the relationship chart and the background for Bones, which mentions the detective. I'll move that over there so you can see it. So we find out that Saranzo originally looked into the people vanishing temporarily in the park, Central Park, but the case went cold and was forgotten about. Saranzo eventually contacted Bones, saying that he got some news for him, holding a battered manila file gripped tightly in his hands, and proceeded to lay out the incidents that had occurred, and then obviously was interrupted by them being kidnapped. So I'm going to say that the darker part of Detective Saranzo is that he actually has encountered the fetch of the previous park ranger and interrogated him quite brutally to discover what had actually happened. And I'm actually going to say actually killed the fetch, and that's how he knew something unexplainable was going on. Okay, so we've got the first room done. We now come to the second room, which is the puzzle or roleplay challenge, a trial that cannot be resolved by combat. And I think it's pretty obvious from looking at the first instance that there are a few things we need to resolve in this, and that is, do the PCs have fetches? If so, what are they up to? And if you look over here at the relationship plan, you'll see that I've coloured in the people who are dead in a sort of red colour, just to make it easy to spot that during the referencing of the chart whilst the game is taking place. So, do the PCs have fetches, and if so, what are they up to? Well, I've already said that I want each PC to have a fetch, so I'm going to put that down. PC has a fetch, and since we seem to be leading to the idea that the fetches are made of the darker impulses of the various characters, I think what we should do is we should note down the fetch along with the name. So obviously that will be the original human name, since they didn't gain their sort of fey names, their changing names, until after being kidnapped. So let's go with fetch Roy Sanders, although I will put Blaze in brackets just to remind me, and for ease of reference, anything you can do to make it easier to reference your notes within whilst you're actually playing the session is all to the good. Better you write a few extra notes now than you struggle to find them during the session. And here I'm just going to note down roughly what they've been up to and what their present state is. Now, since we've decided that fetches are made of the darker parts of the originals, if you will, and remember, these are things that the originals may not even remember. After all, if they're dark, the darkest parts of their souls have been excised or snipped away in order to make these fetches, then they may no longer actually be attached to the original. I suppose I'm riffing a bit on the whole idea of Peter Pan and his shadow being separate from him here. So this will be interesting to see how the players react if and when they do actually find out that these darker parts were once belonging to themselves. So I'm just going to note down a few ideas for those now by looking to the various backgrounds. So if we start off with Roy Sanders, or Blaze, and we can see that originally he was a sports star, a shining light, who suffered from a bad injury and was tempted by the use of illicit substances by his teammate Jason, Travis and Cody. So if I put down tempted by illicit substances, we also have the fact that he knew that if his career didn't work, then his father, Miles Sanders, was a big businessman who'd set him up with something. So I think it's safe to say that we can assume that, given that 10 years have passed, that the fetch has replaced father, Miles Sanders, as the owner of the family business. And since the original Roy Sanders, the original Blaze, was tempted by these illicit substances, I'm going to say that he's built the company into a drugs empire and effectively controls the underworld in the area. So, using the charisma that Blaze has, albeit a poor reflection of it on behalf of the fetches, he's effectively turned himself into a kingpin-esque figure. Now I'm going to write down what does this mean for his girlfriend, and I'll come back and answer that question later. So, because I don't want to get into too much detail on each of them yet, I want to just get a general feel for all of them. So I'm going to jump straight onto Bones. Move that over here out of the way. And we know that he was a very curious man who, through torture, etc., in Arcadia, was forced to become this, I suppose, the torturer himself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that part of his sort of darker half was that he was alienated from humanity, since he spent most of the time amongst the dead. And I'm going to say that this has resulted in him becoming something of a sociopath, perhaps even a murderer, using his job to cover up crimes, or perhaps taking bribes from organised crime to fix the results of autopsies. And this may give him a possible link with the fetch of Roy Sanders. And I'm going to say that in the intervening 10 years he's been promoted to being head coroner. So if we then move on to Hare, and we have a look at his background. Hare was a person who enjoyed the outdoor life and took over as the park keeper of Central Park when the previous keeper, Ronald, disappeared. we know from what we've wrote already that Ronald was replaced by a fetch who was later killed during a brutal interrogation by our friend Detective Mark Soranzo, and you can see that there on the relationship chart. Soranzo himself was then later on replaced by a fetch. So let's see what we've got here. More the darker part of Hare, or Antonio Hernandez as he was known to be. Now I think, although we don't have much in terms of the actual darkness of him personally, it's easy to see that he came from a sort of alcoholic and abusive background, his own father having drank himself to death after his mother Maria died. So I think we can reflect the darkness of his father somewhat in the fetch. That whole idea of sometimes people become what they hate the most. So I'm going to write down it comes from an alcoholic / abusive background. So I'm going to say he left his job as the park ranger. I suppose I should make it clear that that was the fetch doing that. The fetch hit the bottle. Now this is a vagrant in the area surrounding Central Park. Now this is useful for two reasons, because one, it makes it potentially a fetch who is easy to access. He isn't surrounded by underworld figures or the police, etc. He's a homeless person out on the street. It also makes him vulnerable if the players decide to take one of the fetches out. However, it also reflects the Arcadian role that the original Hare was forced to adopt. He lived as this hunted, prey-like creature, and in a way his fetch has become a reflection of that. I think as well that the fetch of Antonio Hernandez or Hare should be less of an obvious villain than the two fetches we've detailed previously. He just seems to more reflect weakness rather than actual malice. So perhaps the PCs might have some empathy for him. Okay, so let's move on to Sway. And I think the obvious thing to do with Sway is that she's very proud of her achievements and very beautiful. Which can all be laudable qualities if not taken to extreme, but obviously since this is the darker impulse, we're taken to extremes here. So the fetch has become a celebrity / media darling. I'm going to put had a string of marriages. Chews people up and spits them out. This might also give an interesting counterpoint, since obviously the original Christina Sway, she became, knows that her fiance was also kidnapped. What happened to the fiance's fetch? I'm going to write that down. player's name on my relationship chart. This is another reason why having these charts is great, since it allows you to quickly look up things like names, or you're making your notes. I can see his name's Charles. I'll write that down. That's another question I'm going to put in, and that's one of the things I like to do in games, and it's something I took from Dungeon World, writing down questions that you don't 100% answer in your plan, but that you're interested in finding out the answer to during play. And quite often I'll prompt players and ask them for their ideas and then build them into the game, since it's nice to get players' contributions in and it makes them feel more involved. So last but not least, in this section I'm going to move on to Wolf. Now Wolf, it's fairly easy to see, got in trouble a lot with the law when he was younger, worked as a doorman, learnt to rely on his fists when he was younger, since he came up again from an abusive background, and it was only the intervention of Mikey Mason, the owner of the Prohibition Bar near Central Park, giving him a break and a chance at a new life, that he actually changed his ways. So I think the fetch of Gabriel Murphy should reflect what he might have been like if he hadn't have received that chance, if he'd have carried on down that darker path. So I'm going to put sort of a bruiser or a criminal enforcer / leg breaker of some kind. This may also again give a possible link to the fetch of Roy Sanders, since he's going to be some sort of criminal don. That's the question: how will this affect his wife Victoria and their first child? And I think that gives us a fair bit to think about with regards to the fetches. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to add a few more notes onto our relationship chart. So now you can see that the relationship diagram's starting to take place, and in a short while I'm going to add some more detail into each of those fetches, but I'll come to that when I start further defining the various NPCs. Okay, so we've just detailed out the various fetches, which are going to be the main sort of roleplay challenge, the player characters finding out who's replaced them and what impact they've had whilst they've been living the player characters' lives. Really pushing forward that whole theme of loss of control and memory, which we've got down on our list as you've just seen there. I'm going to come back and detail this in a bit more extensive detail later on, but for now I'm going to jump straight onto room 3, which is described as the red herring in the 5-room model, which is designed to build tension or add in additional background flavour. Now I don't tend to think of this so much as an actual red herring, since I find that having too many of those in a one-off session can be quite distracting. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm just going to add in a little extra wrinkle to the plot. Now, since we've determined that the main crux of the game is going to be focused on the fetches and how they've subsumed the player characters' lives, it seemed only natural that obviously someone has to create these fetches. Now, originally I've been working on the assumption that it was the Horned God, the Fae who kidnapped them, that did this. However, if we look at it, he seems to be much more of a savage Fae, a hunter, a more sort of medieval figure. So it doesn't really seem appropriate that he'd be actually performing the drudgery of weaving these half creatures, these replacements, into being. Well, at least it doesn't to me. So I think it'd actually be a good idea to have another Fae, or perhaps another Changeling, who is creating these fetches for him and is effectively in the employ of the Horned God. So it seems obvious that this Changeling or this Fae would be in the mortal world, since they need to gain access to the actual people who were going to be replaced, and perhaps they each had an encounter, albeit unknowingly, with this creature which I'm going to call the Weaver, since I'm envisioning a creature that sort of weaves the shadows, the darker parts of the originals into these fetches. So I'll note that down. Weaver equals Fae / Changeling in the employ of the Horned God, creates fetches, weaves them out of stolen darkness / shadows. Did the PCs encounter the Weaver before they were kidnapped? Now, as I'm describing this Fae, describing it as a Weaver, it seems appropriate that I'm thinking of images of a sort of arachnid, almost a sort of spider-like creature, which these sort of creatures are very prevalent in RPGs. You're going to think of like Driders and stuff like that. There's various spider-like creatures, Ariadne in Legend, etc. The Will for Forsaken features its own sort of hosts, as they're called, who are spider spirits that possess people, turning them into strange hybrids of human and spider. And the idea of arachnid and human meldings has always been very unsettling. And of course, spiders are amazing weavers, creating their webs. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to note down a half human, half spider figure. And then what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to look for a picture on Google image search. Half spider, half man. Let's see what that gets us. Okay, so now we come to room 4, which is the climax or showdown, which is the main confrontation of the piece. Now, I think it's fairly obvious that the main confrontation is going to be with the Horned God, either because the players believe that he's going to try and recapture them, or because they're trying to prevent him recapturing other people. So, I'm going to put down showdown with the Horned God on my sheet, which you can see just there. However, I don't just want it to be a massive slugfest, a huge combat, because for two reasons. One, it's not particularly interesting, and two, the Horned God is supposed to be some ancient fey creature, and how many fairy tales, etc., can you honestly think about where the hero just slugs it out with the bad guy for God knows how long, before eventually just beating them to death, basically. Even in fairy tales where people do get killed in the sort of original Grimmer version, there tends to be some sort of clever twist on it, or some sort of device that allows them to overcome their enemy. And I like that idea, so I'm just going to put in device to overcome the Horned God. Or perhaps some form of weakness, perhaps. Or a bane, maybe. Who knows? This is something I'll be looking to detail later on when I actually define the Horned God in more detail, when I build the fronts for my plan, which will detail, for those who aren't aware, what the aims of the Horned God are, a little bit more about his background, and I'll probably do a couple of these, probably one for the Weaver, certainly one for the Horned God, and maybe one or two for a couple of the more prominent fetches, and maybe one or two other NPCs. Who knows, it depends how things develop. I don't want to try and cram too much in because it is only a 4-hour session. Okay, so in order to discover weakness, must research the Horned God, and then I'm making out to myself to detail out the background of the Horned God. And I think the showdown should take place in Central Park, unless players enter the hedge or somehow manage to summon the Horned God. And that pretty much covers room for the climax or conflict, I think. Okay, since we've talked about how the Horned God is going to be defeated by some form of weakness or bane, in effect some sort of MacGuffin that the player characters have to find in order to overcome him, we need to know a little bit more about his background. Now, as I've said, I'm going to fill that in a bit more detail later on, but first I'm going to do a little bit of research using Google. So that we can see the Horned God is one of the two primary deities found in Wicca and some related pagan religions. Represents the male part of the religion's dualistic theological system. So let's have a look at the Wikipedia page, see what else we've got. So associated with nature, wilderness, sexuality, hunting and the life cycle. So I'm going to note that down. Since that all sounds very appropriate given how he's been described in the background. And we've got here that the Horned God was worshipped in Western Europe as a deity of a pan-European witchcraft cult. See that according to pagans, the Horned God is born in winter. And the opposite number is a female god in the summer. also see that various attempts have been made to link the horned god to the devil. So that's another possibility for a weakness. So religious icons. There's a few other gods listed down there that I'm going to open up and have a look at. So let's see the Wild Hunt first. A phantasmal spectral group of huntsmen with accoutrements, hunting, horses, hounds, etc. So I'm going to put a separate note for that. Etc. Hunters may be dead or fairies, depending on the specific myth. Saw the hunt called it kidnapped. So that's an interesting thing. Perhaps you can only defeat the horned god if you cannot see him. See there, we've got an English version of the myth where it mentions a Brythonic king who stayed too long at a fairy wedding feast and returned to find centuries had passed and the land was populated by Englishmen. So that's a possibility. I'll write that down. Move on to have a look at some other stuff. We've got Imbolc, which is important to the horned god. Kronos, which is the name given in Celtic studies to depictions of the horned god. We've also got Herne the Hunter. That's also an interesting legend where he's one of the myths describes him as a gamekeeper who, in the forest in the times of Queen Elizabeth, and having committed some great offence for which he feared to lose his station and fall into disgrace, he was induced to hang himself. So perhaps an ancient gamekeeper who committed an offence and hung himself. And finally we've got an article which is generally about the depiction of deities with horns. So if I open my CMap tools, there we go, there's our relationship diagram. Zoom out a little bit. I like the idea of the ancient gamekeeper who hung himself. I think that's a very appropriate myth, since it reflects someone who suffered a loss, as the player characters have suffered loss. It's something that happened in the past, so it can be linked into the history of the area, thus justifying why the Horned God always appears in Central Park. And also it gives a potential way for the players to defeat the Horned God. Perhaps he can only be killed by being hung in the manner of the original gamekeeper. So I'm going to note that down. And what I'm actually saying is weakness, hanging rope. On the wood of the original tree where he hung. Just readjust that slightly to make it a bit more readable. There we go. So we've pretty much got the Horned God defined there. So I'm going to save that. Okay, so we're going to start planning out our plot diagram, and this will be just a rough tree diagram which shows the different clues that players can find to get between one scene and another. And again, the advantage of this sort of concept mapping software is that it can be added to as the game progresses. So I'm going to start off first of all, appropriate enough, with the start. Players escape from Hedge into Central Park. Year 2015. And that's where we're going to start. Now, because as I've said earlier on, I want to get some form of sort of action scene to prevent a long pause at the start of the game, I want to put a combat in. Put players attacked by Briar. I can spell. By Briar Wolf, Hands of the Horned God. And that's pretty much our basic plot. Now there's other stuff I can add to that, I probably will do later on. There's always a few last minute things you think about, and during the game there'll probably be other stuff that happens or other stuff that the players do that I hadn't predicted, and that's perfectly fine. You don't want to try and set out to cover everything the player characters can possibly do, for a number of reasons. First one being that if you're doing everything by rote and there's nothing interesting or unexpected in, it's quite boring for the GM to actually run it, and that's very easy for the player characters to pick up on. And the second reason is just purely because you will never, with 100% accuracy, predict everything the player characters are going to do. No matter how well prepared you are, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be prepared, because the preparation you have done will help you to cope with those situations when you need to be spontaneous. I know that seems a bit of a contradiction in terms, but having a clear handle on how everything works and how the relationships knit together will help you if the player characters suddenly go off reservation and you have to suddenly think, oh, how's this NPC going to respond to this? If you know what their goals are, you know what their motivations are, you know who they're connected to, it enables you to portray that in a more internally consistent way. So that's pretty much the basic plot done. I'm going to save that and then move on to defining some of the details about the various NPCs. Okay, now I've spent the last hour or so creating some NPC notes. You can see I've got the Weaver here, who is a spider fey creature who creates the various fetches. And I've got a bit of background here, a description, what her goals are, and some brief stats. I've obviously defined the Horned God since he's the main antagonist, the Fey Huntsman. Again, background, goals, and stats. And to accompany him, I've put some quick stats for Briar Wolves, who are a type of hobgoblin who are mentioned in the Changeling rulebook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my plot diagram, which I've got here, and I'm going to detail out the various other NPCs. Now I probably won't talk much while that's going on, so I'll probably fast forward through any bits where I'm not talking. Okay, so that's the main NPCs done. I'm now going to go on to the slightly painful part of streamlining my plot diagram now, because although it is very comprehensive, this humongous plot diagram I've drawn is probably a little bit too complicated for a 4-hour one-off session. Although I do like to get things out in this much detail, because it's always better, in my opinion, to have more ideas and then trim some out than it is to struggle and not have enough ideas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a new map, which I'm going to save as, I'm going to call CTL Simple Plot Diagram. There we go. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink that down a little bit. I'm going to look at the bigger diagram and take the bits I want from that. So I want the start to be the same. There we go. End to be the same. There we go. I've got the start and the end there. So let's see, what do I want in between? And bear in mind, I'm trying to simplify this down a lot, since I've also, a lot of these notes on here are now covered by the NPC notes I've got, which I can link in to the concept map. So I don't actually need quite as much of all of this, although having all of this down did help me to actually work out how I was going to write up the NPC, so it's good to have actually done it. So let's So there you can see we've got our simplified plot diagram, which starts in Central Park as the players first escape the hedge. They'll be attacked by the Briar Wolfhounds of the Horned God. They spot a crazy homeless man fleeing the area. They find the old soaked newspaper. They confront the fetchers who were crafted to replace them, which leads them to discovering the Weaver. They discover about the Horned God's pact with Braden, which is his weakness, and they then confront the Horned God and defeat him. Now this is a lot simpler than if I was going to run a campaign game, but as I say, this is a one-off, so I want it to be a little bit more straightforward. So I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit. And that's pretty much the session sorted. All that's left for me to do now is make some brief notes about the overall character of the various districts of New York and create some additional sort of floating clues that can be dropped in to get the players back on track if they're struggling. So the next thing I want to do is create the newspaper clipping that the players are potentially going to be able to find in the park. Now, because I don't have to detail an entire newspaper, since there's not a great deal of point, it's just there to do one thing to give them a clue to point in the right direction. I'm going to say that it's an old newspaper that's been water damaged. And because I don't want to go to all the effort of creating a whole newspaper, I'm going to use this handy newspaper clipping generator website here, which I'll put a link to in the description at the bottom of this video. And this just allows you to fill in some quick details. So I'm then going to go into our simple plot diagram, which I've got here. And I'm going to link the newspaper image here. So during play, all I'm going to do is click on that, click newspaper, and it'll come up. And during the game, I can share that screen with the players so they can actually see the prop. So I've got my plot diagram laid out in a slightly more simplified format. You can see that there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some extra little clues that can be used to spur things forward if there appears to be a lull developing in the game, or if the player characters seem to be struggling. Now, in a campaign, when things like that happen, you can just sort of let it ride, and you can always recycle things like that afterwards. However, that's not really an option in a one-off game, hence the slightly simplified, more linear progression, put my teeth in, of the plot, and also the additional extra clues. However, it's always a good idea in any sort of investigative game to have some extra clues that can be brought in to prevent lulls or the game stalling, or even just encounters you can drop in should the player characters appear to be struggling. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put in a series of extra clues that won't be linked directly at the start to any of the other areas, any of the other points on our plot timeline, but they will lead to other points. So let's see. So Now I was going to write some notes for the various different districts of Manhattan to go with the map that I'm using for the game. However, I found this handy list of Manhattan neighbourhoods on Wikipedia, which should allow me to quickly search and click into the pages for the various districts if I need to get a quick hint of what the flavour of that district is about. It shouldn't be too necessary because most of the game is centred around Central Park, appropriately enough. However, just in case the players do go a bit off track, I've got this information there to enable me to portray a fairly reasonable facsimile, albeit it's never going to be a 100% accurate depiction of Manhattan. But then again, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be Manhattan as seen through the lens of the World of Darkness. So this should be a great time saver, and I'm all for using any resource, be Wikipedia, DeviantArt, whatever, that save the GM time, since the GMs already have enough to do preparing for games, creating stories, generating NPCs, making props, etc. So anything you can find that adds a bit of extra verisimilitude to your game and that saves you some time has to be a winner as far as I'm concerned. So that's a look into how I prep for my Changeling the Lost one-off. By the time this video is made available to the public, you should be able to see the actual play of the session as well, all being well, and I'll put a link to that in the description down below so you can have a look at that and see how all this planning worked out. Fingers crossed it all went okay and everyone enjoyed the game, since I'm actually filming this before the game is run, but not making it available until afterwards, bizarrely enough. So I hope if you've enjoyed this video or you found it useful, you'll consider clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. As always, if you have any comments, please leave them in the box down below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. I really do enjoy reading what you write. And until I see you next time in the next video, take care and happy gaming wherever you might be in the world.